April 17, 2002. Just outside Kandahar, Canadian soldiers from the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry were finishing a routine night training exercise. They had done drills like this many times before. Live ammunition, anti-tank weapons, machine gun fire cutting across the dark Afghan desert. High above them, nearly 23,000 feet in the air, two American F-16 pilots were watching the flashes below. One of them believed he was under attack. He asked for permission to fire. The controller told him to stand by. Moments later, another instruction came through the radio. Hold fire! 4 seconds later, a 500-pound bomb was falling toward the lights on the ground. Those lights were Canadian soldiers. What followed would shock a nation and raise a question that investigators, commanders, and grieving families would struggle with for years. How could this happen after the pilot had been told twice to wait? If you want to hear more stories like this one, take a moment to subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. What city and country are you in? Now let's go back to the night of April 17, 2002, outside Kandahar, where a routine training exercise was about to turn into one of the most painful moments in modern Canadian military history. In the months that followed the attacks of September 11, 2001, Canada moved quickly. By December of that year, elite operators from Joint Task Force 2 had already arrived in Afghanistan. The government announced in January 2002 that it would deploy a battle group, and the first elements of the Canadian forces departed on February 1st, arriving at Kandahar Airfield as part of Operation Apollo, Canada's contribution to Operation Enduring Freedom, the international coalition assembled to destroy al-Qaeda and dismantle the Taliban regime that had sheltered them. Canada's contribution was not symbolic. The 3rd Battalion, Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, known throughout the military as 3 PPCLI, deployed as a full battle group under the command of Task Force Rakhisan, the American-led formation responsible for operations in the Kandahar region. These were professional soldiers, many of them veterans of the Balkans missions in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, and Kosovo. Sergeant Marc Léger had completed 3 tours in Bosnia-Herzegovina, earning a Deputy Chief of Defense Staff Commendation for his work with displaced civilians in the Livno Valley. He was promoted to acting sergeant in January 2002, weeks before deploying. Corporal Ainsworth Dyer was born in Montreal and raised in Toronto. He had deployed to Bosnia-Herzegovina in 2000, qualified as a military parachutist, and arrived in Kandahar engaged to be married. These were not inexperienced soldiers. They were a tested unit in a recognized training area, doing exactly what soldiers do before combat: preparing. Tarnak Farm was a walled compound of low mud brick structures located approximately 15 kilometers from Kandahar Airfield. Before the coalition campaign began, the site had served as a base for Osama bin Laden and his organization from 1998 to 2001. By April of 2002, it had been repurposed as a live-fire training range routinely used by all coalition forces in the area. The night of April 17th was scheduled for anti-tank drills and machine gun practice by Alpha Company. The exercise had been properly authorized through Task Force Rakhisan. A sentry had been posted at the Kandahar Airfield Tower as part of standard air coordination procedures. At the same time, 2 United States Air National Guard pilots from the Illinois-based 183rd Fighter Wing were completing an extended patrol over northern Afghanistan. Major William Umbach flew as flight lead. His wingman was Major Harry Schmidt, a graduate of the United States Navy Fighter Weapons School, known in aviation circles as Top Gun. Both men had been airborne for several hours. Returning south toward their base and transiting over the Kandahar region at altitude, Schmidt reported what he believed was ground-to-air fire rising from below. What Schmidt observed were tracer rounds from the Canadian exercise, weapons fire directed horizontally at ground targets. A United States Air Force captain present at Tarnak Farm that night would later testify to the Board of Inquiry that the fire could not physically have reached even a fraction of the altitude at which the F-16s were flying. The coalition framework required pilots who believed themselves under attack to report the threat, request verification through the Airborne Warning and Control System, AWACS, and await clearance before engaging. That process existed precisely because coalition ground forces were operating throughout the theater. It was designed to prevent exactly what was now, in the early hours of April 18th, unfolding below. Schmidt had requested permission to strafe with cannon fire. The AWACS controller told him to stand by. A second directive followed, hold fire. 4 seconds passed. The transcript of the cockpit voice recording captures what happened in those 4 seconds with the precision of a legal document. Schmidt declared he was rolling in self-defense. He descended. He released the GBU-12 laser-guided bomb, a 500-pound MAPA-82 fitted with a paveway guidance kit. Approximately 35 seconds elapsed between weapon release and impact. Then his voice returned on the radio. He hoped he had done the right thing. Seconds after the bomb struck, the AWACS controller transmitted the words that made those 4 seconds permanent. Friendlies, Kandahar. On the ground, Alpha Company of 3 PPCLI was in the middle of its exercise when the blast struck their position. Steel fragments and pressure wave tore through the training area. 4 soldiers were killed immediately. 8 others sustained injuries, burns, shrapnel wounds, blast trauma. The military medical response at Kandahar Airfield was described in the Board of Inquiry findings as exceptional, a recognition that swift and professional treatment saved the lives of those who survived. Among the wounded, Sergeant Lauren Ford sustained the most severe injuries. He lost sight in his right eye from blast fragmentation and suffered significant damage to his left leg, beginning years of rehabilitation that he would carry alongside his continued military service. The 4 who did not return were 29-year-old Sergeant Marc Léger from Lancaster, Ontario, 24-year-old Corporal Ainsworth Dyer from Montreal, raised in Toronto, 21-year-old Private Richard Green from Mill Cove, Nova Scotia, and 26-year-old Private Nathan Lloyd Smith, born in Halifax and raised in the Muscotaboit Valley of Nova Scotia. They were the first Canadians killed in a combat zone since the Korean War, a distinction that had stood for nearly half a century, now transferred to men killed not by an enemy, but by a weapon released by an ally who had been told to wait. The Canadian Board of Inquiry, chaired by General Maurice Burrell, released an interim report on May 13, 2002, followed by its final report on June 19. The findings were unambiguous. The Canadian soldiers had conducted their exercise in full compliance with authorized procedures. The range was properly coordinated. The notifications had been made. Every step on the ground had been followed correctly. The board concluded that the pilots were the cause of the incident, and that deficiencies in air coordination and tactical planning, deficiencies the pilots could not correct in the moment, but that the system should have prevented, had contributed to the conditions that made it possible. The American Coalition Investigation Board, co-chaired by Brigadier General Marc Dumas, reached the same core conclusion. Lieutenant General Michael DeLong, representing the Coalition Command, stated publicly that the cause was the pilots' failure to exercise appropriate flight discipline, a violation of the rules of engagement, and an inappropriate use of lethal force against a target that had not been confirmed as hostile. Major Umbach, as flight lead, carried the responsibility of command. He had not initiated the drop, but he had not prevented it. His charges were eventually dismissed. He received a reprimand for leadership failures and was permitted to retire. The case against Schmidt was built on the cockpit recordings. He had been given 2 direct instructions: stand by, then hold fire. Both were transmitted clearly. Both were received and acknowledged. 4 seconds later, he had dropped the bomb regardless, invoking the right of self-defense, a right that applies when a pilot faces an actual, confirmed threat, not a misidentified training exercise conducted by allies on a properly authorized range. On September 11, 2002, 1 year to the day after the attacks that had sent these soldiers to Afghanistan in the first place, Schmidt and Umbach were formally charged. Schmidt faced 4 counts of negligent manslaughter, 8 counts of aggravated assault, and an additional charge of dereliction of duty. The manslaughter and assault charges carried a maximum combined exposure of 64 years of confinement. Those charges were ultimately dropped in favor of a non-judicial Article 15 proceeding. Schmidt appeared before 8 Air Force Commander Lieutenant General Bruce Carlson. On July 6, 2004, more than 2 years after the men he killed had been buried and cremated on Canadian soil, Schmidt was found guilty of dereliction of duty. The punishment was a written reprimand and a fine of $5,672. He was formally prohibited from flying Air Force aircraft. He retained his affiliation with the Illinois Air National Guard. He was not dishonorably discharged, and he did not lose his commission. He subsequently appealed the reprimand. In 2007, a federal judge ruled against him, finding that the public release of the reprimand was warranted because it gave Canadians and Americans alike a transparent account of how the military was holding the responsible pilot accountable. General Carlson's reprimand had not used restrained language. It described Schmidt's conduct as shameful. It cited arrogance and a fundamental absence of flight discipline. It stated that his failure to comply with the hold fire instruction was inexcusable, and that his invocation of self-defense was not a genuine claim of necessity. It was, in Carlson's documented words, a pretext for waging his own war. For the families of the 4 dead, accountability had arrived, and they measured it in a single question. Agatha Dyer, mother of Corporal Ainsworth Dyer, asked it in terms that required no answer. Are our children worth only $5,000? The grief that followed was national in a way that few military losses had been since the Second World War. Prime Minister Jean Chrétien addressed the House of Commons on April 18th. Opposition leaders joined without partisan hesitation. Polling conducted in the weeks after the incident showed that 85% of Canadians believed the government should demand accountability from the United States if the pilots were found responsible. Letters arrived at newspaper offices and volumes editors described as unlike anything in recent memory. What gave the grief its particular weight was not the scale of loss, but its context. These 4 men had not been ambushed. They had not been caught in a Taliban firefight or struck by an improvised device. They had been preparing for exactly the kind of combat their country had asked them to conduct, drilling in the dark on an authorized range, following every procedure their coalition had established. The Board of Inquiry confirmed this. Canadian soldiers had done nothing wrong. Sergeant Marc Léger had enrolled in the primary reserve with the Stormont, Dundas, and Glengarry Highlanders in March 1991. He transferred to the regular force in February 1993, joined the 1st Battalion PPCLI, and was subsequently posted to the 3rd Battalion in 1996. He served 3 tours in Bosnia-Herzegovina and received a Deputy Chief of Defense Staff Commendation for his work in the Livno Valley, where, over 6 months, he had demanded that international agencies provide resources for Serb refugee families returning to destroyed homes, pressing officials and humanitarian organizations until the support materialized. He was parachute qualified and would be awarded the United States Bronze Star posthumously. He had been married to Marley née McIntyre of Edmonton since 1999. Communities in the Livno Valley who had known him mourned alongside his family in Lancaster. Corporal Ainsworth Dyer had grown up in Toronto. He completed his tour in Bosnia-Herzegovina, qualified as a paratrooper, and trained for the regiment's demanding mountain man endurance competition despite suffering a foot injury during the event, completing the course rather than withdrawing. He arrived in Kandahar engaged to be married. He did not return to make it to the wedding. Private Richard Green was 21 years old from Mill Cove, Nova Scotia. His mother, Doreen Coolin, was chosen by the Royal Canadian Legion as the National Silver Cross Mother at the Remembrance Day ceremony in Ottawa in November 2002, the first of 4 consecutive years in which the honor would be held by a mother from Tarnak Farm. Private Nathan Lloyd Smith was 26 years old. He was born in Halifax and raised in the Musquodoboit Valley, attending Gades Brook Junior High School and Eastern Shore District High School. He had attended Seneca College in Newmarket, Ontario, graduating with high honors from a commercial diving program in 1997, receiving the Norm Halliday Award, selected by his peers as the most outstanding student in underwater skills. He joined the Canadian Forces in September 1998 and graduated as the top student in his class at the Battle School in Wainwright, Alberta. He had been engaged to Jody Carter since December 1998. His ashes were received by his mother, Charlotte Lynn Smith of Tatamagouche, Nova Scotia, who was named the National Silver Cross Mother in 2003. A Canadian base in Afghanistan was subsequently named Camp Nathan Smith in his memory. Corporal Dyer's mother, Agatha Dyer, held the honor in 2004. Sergeant Léger's mother, Claire Léger, in 2005. 4 consecutive years. 4 mothers, 4 Silver Cross ceremonies in Ottawa, all from a single night in the desert outside Kandahar. The survivors carried forward. Sergeant Lorne Ford returned to Canada and recovered through years of rehabilitation. He would later return to Afghanistan on a subsequent deployment, a decision he described as a personal need to finish what had been interrupted. Some of the other 8 wounded also returned to service. Others did not. The psychological dimension of their injuries, sustained not by enemy action but by a weapon dropped by an Allied pilot who had been told twice to hold, was a burden the military's occupational health framework was not then fully equipped to address. 23 years have passed since the night of April 17, 2002. What Tarnak Farm revealed about Canada's military experience in Afghanistan was not simply the risk of friendly fire, a risk understood in every coalition operation since the Second World War. What it revealed was the structural vulnerability of a smaller military embedded within a much larger one, operating within a command architecture built primarily around American assumptions about force employment. Canada deployed approximately 2,000 troops to Operation Enduring Freedom in early 2002. The United States contributed tens of thousands. The coordination frameworks, air deconfliction procedures, and real-time communication systems of the coalition reflected the scale and doctrine of its dominant partner. Canadian soldiers operated within that framework professionally and in full compliance. The Board of Inquiry's central finding was unambiguous. They had done nothing wrong. The range was properly authorized. The notifications had been made. The sentry was in position at the airfield tower. The failure was in the air, not on the ground. In response to the inquiry's recommendations, the United States Air Force revised rules of engagement training, fatigue management protocols, and range deconfliction procedures for coalition operations. The board also recommended investment in air-ground combat identification technologies and improved coordination mechanisms for network-centric operations, changes that acknowledged the systemic dimension of what had occurred. Those changes arrived too late for the 4 who died, but they may have made subsequent incidents less likely, and in the operational logic of institutional reform, that is the mechanism through which military organizations process preventable death by converting it into policy. It is necessary. It is also, from the perspective of those who lived with the loss, insufficient in ways that policy cannot address. Schmidt retained his affiliation with the Illinois Air National Guard following the reprimand. His appeal failed in 2007. The manslaughter charges that could have brought decades of confinement were never prosecuted. The fine of $5,672 stood as the sole financial consequence of 4 deaths and 8 permanent injuries, a figure that the families, the public, and the Canadian government all recognized as disproportionate to the loss, even as they understood the limits of what military administrative law could compel. Canada went on to commit more than 40,000 of its men and women to Afghanistan over 13 years of involvement. 158 Canadians died in that country. The 4 from Tarnak Farm were the first. They died not fighting the enemy their country had sent them to face, but in a training exercise on a properly authorized range, following every procedure the coalition had established. Their names are recorded in the Books of Remembrance at the Peace Tower in Ottawa. They are on the Wall of Honor. They are on the memorials in Lancaster, in Mill Cove, and across Nova Scotia. Sergeant Marc Léger, Corporal Ainsworth Dyer, Private Richard Green, Private Nathan Lloyd Smith. They were the first. The system that failed them was changed because of them, and the families who carried the weight of their absence made sure that weight was never invisible.